Hi, this is Stu Stover again. Today we're going to pick up kind of a quirky piece of econ, but we're going to look at the late 1940s and into the 1950s. And there's a number of reasons why this all matters. I know it's history and it's feels like a long time ago, but as World War II ended, there were great fears that the economy was going to slide right back into the Great Depression. And I mean, you can understand why. We had dumped just massive amounts of government money into the economy to build the tanks and the planes and the ammunition and all the other stuff. And you had something like 11 or 12 million, I don't know, not sure how many, folks in uniform. Okay, they all come home, and what do they want? They want a job. Well, all of the companies that were making military goods are obviously laying off and closing factories and doing all that. So there were legitimate reasons why people thought we might slide right back into the Great Depression. So what happened? Why didn't we fall back into the Great Depression? And there were a couple major issues that showed up that changed the game in significant ways. One was something called pent-up demand. Okay, so World War II, people could not buy a lot of stuff because we were producing all these goods and things for the boys overseas, and so you had to sacrifice. We had victory gardens, we collected rubber and tin cans and all sorts of things. And so people had old cars, old refrigerators, old stuff. Well, all these guys came home and they had money in their pocket. What did they want to do? They wanted to spend it. And so there was this sort of the first real significant consumer boom and demand side of the economy showing up, because all of a sudden people wanted to be able to buy this. They felt good. They won the war. All of those things were going on. And so this pent-up demand was just astonishing. It blew most, if not all, of the economists out of the water. They didn't anticipate what was going to happen here. That was huge. Huge. But let me also get to a couple other issues that changed the game and why we didn't go back to the Great Depression. One is that between Truman, a Democrat, Eisenhower, a Republican, in the 50s, you had a commitment to taking care of the vets. Okay, and frankly, lots of other folks too, but vets in particular. So you had VA housing assistance, you had VA educational grants. And so one of the things that happened here is an awful lot of military folks went back to school when they came back from overseas. And we made it possible, not necessarily easy, but certainly made it possible for them to get an education. That ended up being a good thing for America, because the 1950s was when we built much of the suburbia America as we know it today. Now, obviously, it was the start. We've obviously continued to that in all kinds of ways, but the notion was we took these folks out of the workplace, because if they're in school, they're not counted in the workplace. And then they get all these skills. Well, one of the things that sort of shows up here is that we are creating a far better middle class in America because of all the skills and all the other stuff that shows up. So a middle class, a consumer-driven middle class is emerging in a rather massive way in this time frame. Lots of pluses with how that one ended up playing out. But let's think about some other things that were going on particularly 1950s. Okay, so you had the Korean conflict, which started when Truman was in office, but then Eisenhower kind of finished it off. But we ponied up the money to do that. We also worked with the United Nations and all of our allies to deal with the North Koreans and then the Chinese in that particular conflict. Some of you know this, but that conflict is technically not over yet. We never signed a peace deal. Great. Anyway, but we ponied up the money. Did anybody complain about that? No, because it was part of that effort to stop the spread of communism. So you had the Soviets that wanted to take all of Europe and the Iron Curtain, but you also had these issues that were showing up in Asia. It's one of the reasons why we had the kind of trade policy we did, because we wanted to encourage countries around the world to prosper, because if people aren't prospering, they are vulnerable to whatever bad answer may be out there. And communism was, particularly in that era, was not a good answer to run societies. And so we encouraged them to trade with us. We allowed them to send their goods to us as a way for them to build up their societies, get prosperity. In South Korea's case, an opportunity to create the kind of wealth so that they could defend themselves if there was another incursion from the north. So that anti-communism stuff was very much at the heart of so many policies in Washington. Obviously tariffs and trade and all those kind of things. We'll get into more of that stuff in another segment. But you had all of this happening. You also had Eisenhower built the interstate highway system. Can you imagine how expensive that was? And he sold it to Congress and the American people as a way to be able to quickly move the troops from one side of the country, up or down or east or west, quickly. Can you imagine trying to move 1 million troops and tanks and everything else on 2-lane highways that run across the country in the old days? Probably awful scenarios if you want to do it quickly. Did that do a tremendous service to America to have the interstate highway system? Okay, did we ever really need it for the military? Well, not particularly. What did we need it for? Trade, interstate commerce, and facilitating the movement of goods around the country. And we have a term in Econ called transaction costs. And it simply means the lower we can reduce the transaction costs, the easier it is for people to be consumers and buy and be a part of the whole process. And that works whether we're talking about credit cards versus checks, or it works just as well as we talk about how easy it is to facilitate the movement of goods with an interstate highway system. So we ponied up piles of money in the 1950s to do major infrastructure projects that were very expensive. Did anybody blink at that? Probably not very many. But there's other stuff that we did too. We were providing 10% of GDP to rebuild Europe and to rebuild Asia. And why did we do that? I mean, was it just we were altruistic and we wanted to help all the... No, we're not a particularly altruistic country, although sometimes maybe. But what it was is we wanted to do something different than happened in World War I. So we didn't want the punishment at the end of World War II like we did at World War I, because most observers thought that the punishment actually ended up leading in very dramatic ways towards World War II. And so we wanted to build these countries as opposed to making them suffer and making sure their people were fed and all of those kind of things. Building healthier societies in all kinds of ways. So, for example, in Japan, we rewrote their constitution. And one of the articles in their constitution that we wrote was, "Thou shalt never have a military forever and a day." Oh, wow. a major country in the world can't have a military? Well, it wasn't completely true. They could have a defensive force. They could have in essence, a National Guard, but they couldn't have offensive capability. What did that mean? When we write that into their Constitution, it pledges us to defend them forever and a day. Is that why we still have military bases in Japan? Well, there's a lot of other complicating factors for that one, but that was sort of the mindset of what was going on in America in those days. Very optimistic. We were the only major economy standing, so we had tremendous ability to do all kinds of things just because there was nobody else around. And so these things were astonishingly powerful at building a middle class and creating a healthy economy where inflation is low, unemployment is low, people are working, making money, life is getting better. So there was very much in that era a notion that I've got it better, much better than my parents had it, and my kids are going to have it better than I have it. So there was a faith that the education system was going to be a good thing, and it was cheap and affordable, and there were a lot of pluses all the way around. So in the 1940s, 50s, we did that. We're rebuilding, we're paying for the Korean conflict, and all sorts of interesting good things are happening. Now, are there some bad things? Well, maybe. Race relations were still awful in this era. The role of women, which we will talk about in some other episodes as we talk about the rise of civil rights and the rise of the women's movement, the rise of the environmental movement. We had in the 60s all these movements that were going on. But let me just point out that what this did in the broad scope, it said fiscal policy as an approach to managing the economy, managing the government, the role of government, worked. And it was successful, and frankly, it was. Despite all the criticisms we have today about that, it was astonishingly effective, and there was broad agreement on both the Republicans and the Democrats that this was a reasonable way to go. Very different times than what we live in today. So when we pick up this next, we're going to go to the 1960s, because there's some very consequential stuff that happened in the 60s for us in economics. So thank you very much. I'll see you in the next one.